We are Things I Found Online, coming to you from our respective homes and bringing you, our home viewers and listeners, the finest in podcasting, entertainment, and online information. If you are potentially pandemically panicked, then we have just the guest for you. Dr. Marc Schoen specializes in altering the mind's response to fear. Yes, your minds. So be unafraid, be very unafraid, and settle in with our panel, Danny Mann, and producer Dina Friedman. I am Jamie Alcroft, and here is our host, Louise Palanker. Louise.
Thank you, Jamie. I am a little bit afraid of you, full disclosure. Our guest is Dr. Marc Schoen, who has specialized in mind-body medicine for over 25 years. He is here to help us all survive and thrive through and beyond this pandemic. First, let's go to Jamie and Danny. It's been a sad week, and what have you two found online?
Well, just to play around with some terminology before we dive into this, yes, it has been a sad week, and what we're about to talk about is the passing of a couple of very iconic, well-known people. But obviously what's going on in the greater world around us and all the deaths and all the sadness connected to this pandemic, these are on different scales. So what we're about to talk about is really some lives well lived and lived long. So
yeah, well, I think we're talking about a celebration
yes.
of lives, because these people, they lived out their dreams and they shared their dreams with us, and they brought their dreams to us.
And a lot of times people joke about how these things come in threes or fours, but there's been quite a cluster of them lately, probably led off by one of the most iconic musicians ever, Little Richard.
Yeah.
Do any of you know his actual name?
No.
It's Richard Wayne Penniman. And for those who don't know his significance, he's considered the innovator, the architect, kind of the founding father of rock and roll. Mm-hmm. And almost everybody that we grew up on idolized him. Elvis, the Beatles. The Beatles opened for him on a couple of tours. They also did a bunch of covers of his songs.
Absolutely, yeah.
And he taught Paul how to sing Long Tall Sally. I mean, he is worshipped and revered in the rock world, and
it is a loss, definitely.
Definitely a loss. But 87, lived a good long life.
May I also add, he was a very funny guy.
Little Richard was.
Yeah.
Did you meet him?
Did you
know him?
Yes. So there was talk of giving him his own radio show. He was quite a character.
Oh, that's it.
So you actually met with him?
Yes.
Oh, how exciting. Was he all dolled up and fancy and smelly?
He was his suits were shiny.
Yeah, he's super shiny.
I did get to work with him once, but probably not at the same level as Louise did, so she probably had a little more.
No, it was just meetings. I didn't
and since we have a few of them to cover, I want to connect him, since we mentioned the Beatles, to the passing of someone that a lot of people might not know. I think some of us do. Astrid Kirchherr, who was very influential with the Beatles before they became the Beatles, when they were still the Quarrymen and
working out in Hamburg.
They did their 10,000 hours at these little ratty clubs in Hamburg, and Astrid and a couple of her friends were sort of existentialist, beatniky, all dressed in black, berets, sitting in the front, and caught wind of it and became sort of acolytes and befriended them. And one of her friends was a guy named Klaus Voormann, who was there with her all the time. And he ended up being an essential element in the Beatles later on as both a designer and a bass player. But Astrid fell in love with Stu Sutcliffe, who was then the cute, good-looking Beatle before he left. But she took all the great pictures of them and invented the Beatle haircut, which was modeled after her own hair.
Her own hair, yeah. Now, they made a film about those days.
Backbeat.
It's called Backbeat.
Wonderful movie.
It's a great film. If you've never seen it, you must see it. And in some of the scenes during Backbeat, John Lennon's accent was so thick that they were afraid Americans couldn't understand it. So they hired me to come in, and I looped John Lennon in that movie.
I didn't know you looped on Backbeat.
Yeah.
That is so cool because I love that movie. I mean,
I love that movie too. It's great. I did a couple of Scottish guys in that movie too.
Yeah, but that was on a drunken night on a boat.
Yeah, she said, she's a right tree. And they said, nobody's going to understand that. What did he say? And I said, well, he said, she's a right treat. I'd like to have a go at her.
Okay, could I have you two as John and Paul pay tribute to Astrid?
Well, Astrid was she's really into Stu Sutcliffe, who was with us earlier. And then Pete Best came along, and he was hitting on Astrid quite a bit.
I know, but, I mean, I know you and Stu were close, but, I think I was always a bit jealous because, let's face it, he was cuter than I was.
Well, you should have been jealous. Everyone was cuter than you were, Paul.
Oh, John, don't start again. Do you want to split up again?
I'm not starting. You started it.
Do you want to split up again?
No, I don't want to split up again. I'd be in pieces.
John, are you in pieces over Fred Willard?
Fred Willard.
I am. What a friend to so many people, and just talk about a celebration of life. Just a warm feeling comes all over me when I think of Fred. He was truly, genuinely one of the nicest men.
As nice as he was talented. Did you know him very well? Did you work with him?
Generous. I never worked with him. I just knew him because he and Tom Poston came to my partner and I in the late 80s and asked us to coach them on being a comedy team. Because my partner and I had a TV series then in the 80s, and we were pretty hot. Those were the 2 months that we were really popular. And Fred and Tom came to us and said, "Can you teach us?" I said, "You can't teach somebody how to, be a comedy duo." And they were Tom Poston and Fred Willard, these two icons, just working in front of me, and they did their material, and their material was honestly quite weak. Is anybody listening? This doesn't leave the room. Their material was pretty weak.
Oh.
So we tried to get them to just fall back on their personalities. Their natural caricatures that they each were in their own way.
And one of Fred's gifts, of course, is he was a master improviser. And just for any listeners and watchers, watch any of the Christopher Guest mockumentaries, especially Best in Show, which sends up dog shows. And the commentary between him and Jim Pittick as the two commentators it's just, you can't wait to come back to them each time for how funny he is.
Priceless.
Let's go to Ken Osmond first, because I'd like to close with our tribute to Jerry Stiller.
Yeah, of course. Ken Osmond, who a lot of people won't know, but because Leave It to Beaver has been in reruns in every country on earth for so long, he played Eddie Haskell, who was a friend of Wally and the Beavers. And he
really wasn't a friend of the Beavers. Get out of here, you little squirt.
A friend of Wally. He was Wally's best friend.
He was Wally's best friend, and Beavers a sort of nemesis. But his hallmark is the word obsequious. He was the first
obsequious.
Browner. Yes, obsequious. He was TV's first Browner. And he would come into a room and go, "Good morning, Mrs. Cleaver. That dress is quite fetching. My mom doesn't wear anything like that. You look so wonderful." And the other guys are just going.
All right. Yeah. I'd just like to say this about Ken Osmond. Here we have a child who came up with an iconic character that we still quote these many years later. That kid was brilliant as Eddie Haskell.
And it's funny because, as you say, that we still quote, because if somebody says something like, "Gee, Louise, that's a beautiful scarf," and I'll say to Jamie, "Oh, nice, Eddie. Can we go now?" Like,
come on.
Doing it, Eddie Haskell is
it's the way he did it. He just was so good as a child actor.
I know.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I want to go on to Jerry Stiller. Who, what a life, what a career.
92.
What a guy.
Starting off, of course, a brilliant comedy team with his wife, Ann Mira.
Ann Mira, yes. Ann Mira.
Did tons and tons of wonderful work and begat two extremely talented children. I wasn't as aware of Amy's stuff and looked her up and went, "Oh my God, she's
so good."
Very good. Very talented.
Stiller is great.
And before he even passed away, I mean, just recently, part of one of the little games I play with myself during this pandemic is I've been watching a lot of like outtakes from old TV shows, and the Seinfeld outtake reels are phenomenal. And one of the classic ones is that "You Want a Piece of Me" is the thing in the police station with Elaine going head to head with him and cracking everybody up take after take after. Nobody could stay straight, especially Louise Dreyfus.
Julia Louise Dreyfus.
Julia Louise Dreyfus, who would crack up over everything.
Sure.
And was the cause of most of their outtakes, but still are put away. And George, Costanza falls on the floor rolling. I mean, he's so intense, and he had such a great, like, he always had a great career, but like later he kept trying to retire and kept getting 10-year sitcoms.
Yeah.
Because he didn't want to do Seinfeld, got hired, was going to quit after that, and ended up on King of Queens. Well, he had the last laugh on all of us. He retired for good, and what a great life. Amazing talent.
Well, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Marc Schoen, who I'm sure is a big fan of all of the above that we have mentioned. Dr. Marc Schoen has specialized in mind-body medicine for over 25 years. Dr. Marc Schoen was among the first to examine how the mind and body can be retrained to reduce an inflammatory response to emotions and events that may trigger us. His work has been featured extensively on television, radio, and in magazines and newspapers such as the LA Times, Wall Street Journal, Oprah, Scientific American, USA Today, WebMD, Fortune Magazine, Yoga Journal, and many others. Dr. Marc, can you tell us about the type of problems that your techniques can successfully address?
The beauty of my work is that it works on how the mind affects the body. And so many physical conditions are affected by the mind. And so I can influence pain, sleep, physical symptoms such as skin problems, gastrointestinal problems, as well as more psychological ones like bad dreams or panic attacks. And one area that I do quite a bit of work in is performance, whether it's performance on an exam or performance on the basketball court. So you can use these methods in a lot of areas.
So give us some examples of the type of work that you do with someone who comes in and says, my skin keeps breaking out. So you're saying that everything from breaking out skin to better performance in sports could be affected by your methods.
Yes. Actually, there is a commonality between, say, sports and skin or GI problems, and it has to do with fear. And fear is in this older part of the brain known as a limbic system. And this fear region of the brain creates this inflammatory response. And this inflammatory response ultimately produces skin eruption. In the same way, when we are under pressure, trying to perform well with the last minute or seconds, the fear center is the area that is often activated if we're not used to performing well under pressure. So what happens is that when we're fearful of not succeeding or missing or feeling the pressure of other people watching or judging us, the fear center goes off. And then what many people know is this fight or flight reaction goes off, which then starts stealing blood supply from different parts of the body, including the brain, and then it interferes with our ability to perform. So it is a huge thing that underlies so many problems is this fear reaction. And today, this fear reaction is just magnified, and therefore it is at the heart of so many problems we are all facing today.
Can I toss in a quickie here? Just I'm curious what your take is as you watch the news and read the paper and whatnot about why amongst people on the news, how some of the stuff has people very fearful and yet other people either not so much or not at all that are willing to go out and say, hey, this doesn't exist. Hey, it's a hoax. Hey, it's whatever. I don't care. I need to get back to work. People seem to have such different fear thresholds.
I think there is something to be said for a fear threshold, but I also think that what we're seeing is how people manage fear. Some people manage fear by becoming consumed with it and then paralyzed by it. Other people say, it's like, you know what, I'm not scared of this. I'm not going to let it bother me, and sort of go the other way as a defense against fear. The old adage of that is like sort of like whistling as you walk through the graveyard.
So that's more like denial, but I think that fear plays a role in keeping us alive. And so there's a balancing act that we humans perform throughout our lives of trying to figure out what to react to and what is a false alarm. Is that not so, Dr. Marc?
Certainly fear is merited in a lot of cases. And fear, of course, developed, as a primitive species to help us survive, genuine physical threats, a lion chasing us, someone throwing a spear. But fear was never really meant to be used in the way it's used today, where there isn't a lot of physical threat until recently with this virus, where the fear center is going off, being triggered, that is, with being late to the office, or an approaching deadline, or someone being insensitive. And so the fear reaction in us is so hair trigger compared to the way it was ever designed to be. And so now you take this very hair trigger fear response, and then you mix in a genuine physical danger. I think it goes over the top, and we're getting many more physical symptoms, many more psychological symptoms. And I think a lot of the people going out there and pretending that the virus doesn't exist is a form of, like you said a moment ago, Louise, a form of denial, or what we call reaction formation. So yes, you want to find the sweet spot where it's not controlling us. It doesn't occupy a big, large space, but just the space that's merited.
So what are you finding? What are you finding as because we're speaking to friends and family, but you're speaking to a lot of people, specifically people who have a heightened sense of concern that they need to address through a professional such as yourself. What are you seeing? Can you share that with us?
Yeah, boy, I would say that the most common symptom that people are presenting are sleep disruption problems. That's number one. Number two would be panic attacks, anxiety would be number two for sure. And then there's the other symptoms that are more physical that people are feeling: headaches, stomach ache, backaches, neck aches. And then finally, there's the mood component. A lot of mood problems, depression, sadness.
Dina, you had a question.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm gonna quote you exactly here, but you talked about something about fear, not what it was designed to be in terms of fear. And I know you obviously wasn't designed, but it's an interesting image. But it led me to wonder, where does fear evolve from, either in mankind going way back or just in ourselves? Is that something we learn from our parents or our environment as children, or is the wiring different in everybody?
Yeah, the amygdala, which is the fear center in this older part of our brain, it's been there probably since we're like a mammal. We split off from being reptiles and became a mammal. And so it's there anytime this very primitive part of the brain senses that it is in danger. So a lot of it is instinctual, but then as we evolve, it starts becoming things that it was never meant to do. And so yes, it could be influenced by parents, influenced by what we see on TV, what people tell us we should be fearful of. So there is a learned component. But the way I think of it is that this fear center has this sort of threshold. And as long as our level of discomfort stays below this threshold, then the fear reaction, or what I like to call the survival instinct, is not triggered. But once that discomfort exceeds that threshold, then the fear center goes off.
We're open.
So that you can see that the bottom line here is our ability to manage discomfort. If we don't manage it well, then we are being triggered constantly.
And do you feel like the internet is exacerbating that even before pandemic?
I think the internet definitely feeds on fear. And we know news is sold by inducing fear in people rather than just making them happy. So politicians, media, and all these different extreme groups, they use fear to mobilize people.
I think there's different types of people, though, because I was asking someone, because I tend to, when I'm in a fearful state, I tend to not spend money or eat or any of these things that others do when they're distressed. But I asked this kid who was in one of my classes, I said, do you think people spend more money when they're scared? And he went, oh, yeah. So I think they're taking advantage of the way a lot of people function. Some people shut down when they're scared, and some people get overly active to try and feed their fear with something that will mask it, I guess.
Well, doctor, when that older part of your brain where the fear lies kicks in, the newer part of the brain, I assume, is the intellect. And does not the intellect come into play where your thought process says it's silly to be afraid of this? You start rationalizing why you're not afraid, and that can be, assuage your fears, so to speak.
Well, it's a very good question. If you think about us having two different parts to our brain, one is this older part, and it's this limbic system where the fear center is, where pain is, hunger, sleep, and so on. And then we have the newer part of the brain called the cerebral cortex. And that's where the logical, analytical, reflective, inductive kind of logic part of the brain is. Now, the fear center, since it's in this older part of the brain, is directly connected to the fight or flight part of the body. And you can see why, because when we're in danger, let's say a lion's coming after us, to sit and think whether, is this a nice lion or is it a bad lion? It doesn't do us any good. So we were designed, or evolved is the better word, so that when we were in danger, the fight or flight system happened instantaneously. But see, the cerebral cortex, the newer part of the brain, does not have a direct link to this fight or flight system. Mm-hmm. So what happens is that this emotional part of the brain triggers, and then the cerebral cortex is trying to catch up. It's sort of like if you had an adult driving the car, and all of a sudden the kid from the back seat just pops up into the front seat, grabs that adult, throws him into the back seat, and he's driving the car, and the adult's trying to get back into the front seat. And so it's not a perfect balance. So ideally, in modern types of therapy that people have heard of, cognitive behavioral, they do try to use this more analytical, cerebral part of the brain to sort of tame and smooth or mellow out that emotional part. But as you know, sometimes it's pretty hard to do, to talk it or lecture it. Sort of like I remember when my kids were young and one of them might have a temper tantrum, and I might say, well, it's really not a good idea to hit your head on the wall. They don't listen because it's not speaking the correct language. And that's the dilemma that we humans have, trying to balance out this emotional part of our brain.
So what can you talk about some of the techniques that you use in hypnotherapy and how and why you believe that they're more effective than simply talking to a person about their relationship with their mother?
Well, I think that if we consider that we have these different parts of the brain, cognitive behavioral, the very popular therapy today, again, tries to use logic to lecture this emotional part. To me, it never made sense. It's sort of an indirect way of going there. It always made more sense to me. Why not start at the source? Why not start in this emotional part of the brain? So I began early in my career trying to figure out ways that I could condition this emotional part of the brain to make it create change. And so the hypnosis I've developed through the years is meant to be able to recondition fear, hunger, sleep, pain. And then after we can recondition these parts of the brain, then we can start changing the more cognitive, the intellectual part of the brain. So by design, I'm a bit on the impatient side, and I like to make things happen fast. And so I'd rather go for it in a direct way. And so that's where I think there's some advantages. That's not to say that the traditional methods don't work. There's plenty of research that show they work. But I'm interested in expediency and making things happen fast.
And yeah, go ahead, Jamie.
Well, so you deal with the limbic portion of the brain first, the entire structure. Now, how do you reach back into that ancient treasure box there of emotions and instincts?
Hitting your head against the wall.
Hitting your head against the wall, that works.
Yeah. It works.
That's the first thing I ask people to do. That doesn't knock some sense into them. No. It's an interesting thing. Before you can go like into a mine that's going deep into the soil to find gold or diamonds, you have to frame it so that as you proceed downward, it's not going to cave in. So the same thing is true in dealing with this. You have to create first a level of safety. And safety is a feeling. And so what I do is I create a safety. And it's kind of like a muscle, building a muscle. And I build the safety muscle in people. And if I build it strong enough, then it's bigger than the fear response. So now, once I've built that muscle, I can start going into all those very strong fears. And then, by building this muscle in the brain, the safety muscle, it can then manage those fears much differently. And then through a process of what would be called conditioning, or known as, like a lot of people know this as Pavlovian conditioning, is where you pair one thing with another, two things that have no relationship with each other. And by pairing them together, you create a relationship. So now we make it so when someone's going into one of their fears, let's say their fear is of heights, falling down when they look down from a high building. By pairing it with a sense of the safety muscle, or sometimes I call it the discomfort muscle, is that it makes it so that when they look and peer down and think about falling, it no longer triggers the fear response. Now, here's the key thing. You may think, oh, this is just kind of like a form of desensitization. What I'm really doing is not trying to take discomfort away, because discomfort is inevitable. We can't stop being uncomfortable in our world, but we can make it so that when we're uncomfortable, it does not, again, exceed that discomfort threshold and push the fear response. So through conditioning and doing this, it becomes possible to make it so that when people are uncomfortable or they think about something bad that happened in the past, it no longer is such a discomfort level that they go into a fear reaction or an avoidant reaction.
So talk a little bit about hypnotherapy, because if people have never been hypnotized, they may think, oh, well, you can't hypnotize me. So it's not some kind of hypnotic trance. It's just asking your patient to close their eyes while you speak, and they can go into some sort of altered state, sleep-like state, or not. It doesn't really matter, correct?
Yes, I mean, an altered state would mean anything other than your normal consciousness. And there's a huge continuum between being fully awake and sleep. So there's a lot of space in between there. Now, many people believe that the depth of hypnosis is ultimately what creates the clinical efficacy of it, but not really. What makes it work is that someone becomes open to new ideas. So if I had to define what hypnosis is, it's called just influence. It's just influence, where I earn someone's trust, develop a rapport, then they're open to new ideas. And if they're open to new ideas, then I'm able to take them down a path that will create change. If I fail in creating that trust, then I don't succeed. So the ultimate thing is not the depth or being asleep or consciously anesthetized. It's trust and then ultimately safety. So that's what hypnosis is.
And you create customized recordings for people that you suggest that they listen to daily, so that they keep that cushion in their subconscious that protects them from falling into fear.
Well, the tape or sound file, yes, is designed to use all the different ideas, methods that I've been able to sort of gather from someone that touches those areas, and then make it so they now react differently. It's sort of like a way to think about it is, if let's just say someone was having a recurring dream of running from someone, out of danger. And then what the hypnosis does is take whatever that fear is in someone and then start twisting it, changing it, just modifying it. So maybe first you start running from someone, and then you realize, like, I don't need to run. And then after a while, you listen to the tape a little bit longer, and then you realize you don't even need to run at all, that there is no danger and no one's even chasing you.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of a way of taking those fears and just slightly starting to shift them so that the brain, the body react differently. And that can be created with the hypnotic sound file.
Now, what have you learned and discovered in this pandemic in terms of how you treat people? And because now you're no longer meeting people face to face, have you learned anything about treating people via telemed or via Zoom that you wouldn't have learned without this pandemic?
Perhaps the biggest eye-opening for me was the fact that this telemedicine or telehealth with hypnosis actually works. To my surprise, I just thought it just wouldn't have the same kind of power or effectiveness. But my pleasant surprise was to find that, wow, I'm able to do this with people I've never seen live. I mean, I've done it a number of times with people I'd seen, before in my office, because I see people, who might be in different countries or visiting different states. So I've done it quite a bit, but never someone that I hadn't started with live. So yes, that was the big surprise.
Wow. Any questions?
Dr. Marc, I just was wondering, I just want to go back a little bit to the customization aspect of the tapes or the technique, the sound file. It seems like that's an important aspect of this, because we all have a limbic system, most of us, that's operational. And we all have to deal with a certain amount of fear and anxiety and stress in our lives. But then what if you're someone with a really, primed amygdala because you've had trauma in your life, or you've had difficulties stemming from your childhood, or like going, kind of deep into your psyche or deep into your experiences? It seems like they would require a different approach. Like there should be a tailored approach for people depending on kind of where they are with their fear responses and their amygdala.
Yes, it's the more it's possible to tailor the intervention, the better it can be. And absolutely right. You know, some people have much more sensitive amygdala that goes off in situations where there might be very little provocation objectively, but it goes off. So it can take more time for absolutely sure that because you're right, if you make someone try to do something before they're ready, you'll have a bad reaction. But it's possible to slowly build that muscle, to build it up, to strengthen it, so that you can get results. But yes, I certainly would not want anyone to think that this is something that can always happen in 1 or 2 times. Sometimes it can be 3 to 7, which is a pretty good. Sometimes it'd be 3 months. Sometimes it can take a lot longer if you have a significant trauma in there. But the good news is that it's changeable. That's the good news. And but again, the key part of it, and I want to make sure I emphasize this, so it's not seen as strictly as a technique, but to think of it as, again, trust and safety. If you can build trust and safety in someone, even if it's just one-on-one, then it becomes much more possible to build that trust and experience that trust outside of that relationship. And then once you go outside of it, then you think, wow, okay, I can do it in this situation. I bet it's now possible to now generalize it wider and wider.
Dr. Marc, one of your areas of interest is something you call the letdown effect. Are you concerned about how this trauma will hit folks once we are past this pandemic?
Yes, I think since everyone has been so revved up, and I suppose I should just define it a little better about the letdown effect. The letdown effect is something I wrote about that many of us have experienced, and certainly I was one of them, where we can do reasonably well under pressure and stress. And then once the stress and pressure or deadline is done, we get sick. Most of us learned it in college, after finals, we'd all get sick. And then I was really good at going on vacation and getting sick. And so what happens is that once we feel that the threat is done, our body shifts dramatically in a biochemical way, which makes us more vulnerable to infection, disease, and so on. So it is possible that as people shift, if it does become possible, from this very stressful threat state back to a more normal equilibrium, there could be a letdown.
Just a thought that came to me a few minutes ago, something you said, I can't remember the trigger right now, but if you could share this fantasy and see what comes out, what do you think it would be like trying to hypnotize Trump?
Oh my gosh, I think remember, we're dealing with trust and safety. I think it might be being able to conjure that up.
He's a carrier.
But I have to say also, you might find this interesting, is that I've often at times been very surprised that people I would think that would not be good at this are pretty good at it. Like the example I'm thinking about are, at one time when I had more time in my schedule, I would see traumatized policemen, LAPD, who are just trained to not trust, to be very guarded, and not let people close. And once they would come into my office and I'd have them take off all their weapons, which would take a couple minutes, then there were these very vulnerable, open, receptive people that were great hypnotic subjects.
Interesting.
That is interesting. It's like almost like once they had permission to be vulnerable, they were more than ready.
Well, they put on an attitude just the same way they put on their uniform and their ammunition. And,
Sure. Well, I was looking through your website, Dr. Marc, and that you teach and you hold seminars or popular workshops, and among these are boosting athletic performance under pressure and competition, boosting decision-making under pressure, coaching to win big by retraining the brain, transforming fear, the survival instinct and negativity into safety and power, embracing uncertainty and change and opening the door for innovation, improving the results of your sales force, and the list goes on and on. You guys can check out his website. But how did you come to define these seminars and learn what people were most interested in areas of improvement?
If you think about all those different topics, you'd find that the common denominator for virtually all of them is fear. And so through the years of doing this, I realized that what I'm always doing is managing fear for people and making it so that it helps them do what they want to do, whether it's sales, performance, whether it's a musician, someone giving speeches, a lawyer standing up in court. All of these relate to the fear response and make it so people can not be overcome by fear. And then very importantly, all of them involve this part of discomfort. So making discomfort not a threat in anyone's life or our lives, but making it something that we accept, aren't afraid of, and then we can do whatever we need to do, no matter how uncomfortable it gets on the outside.
So you call it Pilates for the brain?
It's my way of thinking from a neuroscience perspective, what I'm doing. I'll give you sort of the neuroscience explanation of it so it makes sense, is that if we have something that scares us, let's say it's public speaking, it's like a train that goes from public speaking directly to the fear center of the brain. It's a non-stop train. The thought of public speaking, my heart starts beating, I start shallow breathing, and so on. So then what I am ostensibly doing is then creating other roads, pathways in the brain that lead to different parts of the brain that have nothing to do with fear. So the pathway to the fear center is still there, but now I'm creating other spokes, just like in a bike, that go to different places. So in this way, the fear reaction is now diminished. It's sort of like a rainbow. If the rainbow is always red, that's all we'd see. But we start throwing other colors, green, teal, magenta. Well, I'm a guy, so I'm not too good about colors, but yeah, you get the idea. You start putting more colors into the rainbow. Now that red is now just a small part of the rainbow. And that's what I think of Pilates, is creating all these different kind of calisthenics and stretches and loosening up other parts of the brain that can now manage that discomfort better.
Can you give us any examples? Because I know you work with elite athletes, and so you're saying, well, fear is just as much of a performance impediment to an athlete as it is to a lawyer, which makes sense to all of us. But it's like it's a difficult one because it's so quantifiable. How many balls you throw into baskets is so quantifiable. So that's fascinating because you have that data. Can you point to any anecdotal stories without revealing anyone's identity about how much better people performed after your training?
Actually, could you name some names?
Yeah, I want to hear it too. Yeah.
Part of my work at UCLA has been to work with a number of the sports teams through the years. And so since you brought up throwing basketball, into the hoop, let's take one example. Years ago, I was working with a person at UCLA who was a senior, and he wanted to be drafted. And he wasn't a particularly good free thrower. Maybe it was 65%, 62%. Now he wanted to do incredibly well because scouts were watching him. And so the pressure of everyone watching him and having to perform and knowing that there was so much more at stake, that led to him now making free throws about 40% of the time. And so one of the coaches sent him to me and said, "Can you work with him?" And I went to Pauley Pavilion to see him play just before seeing him. And I saw what was happening is that in key points toward the end of the game, when he was being fouled and had to go to the free throw line, all the people in Pauley Pavilion were aware that he was having problems with free throws. And so he'd step up to the line and there'd be this gasping moan, "Oh no!" And then of course he would miss the throws. So I brought him to my office and I started asking him questions. And I asked him, "When was the first time you remember being afraid?" And one of the first things he thought of was giving oral reports in elementary school, having to get up in front of class and give an oral report. And I said, "Well, tell me about that." He says, "Well, yeah, I'd get so scared of doing oral reports, my legs would shake, and then eventually I couldn't even speak." And I said, "Well, what would happen when that would happen in class?" He said, "Well, as I'd be going up there, the kids would snicker, some would say, 'Oh no,' or they'd laugh at me, and that just made the problem worse." So then I realized that here he goes up the Pauley Pavilion to make free throws. He's going up there to give an oral report. And so everyone moaning and gasping brings him back to being in 5th grade. And so what I had to do was make it so that pressure that he felt to perform well was no longer attached to giving an oral report. To make it so the pressure of having to make that basket no longer triggered the fear response. And once I did that, he began to make free throws at a much higher rate, like 70%.
So as a hypnotherapist, once you identify the problem, is that the most creative part of your job, is figuring out how to create those pathways through the imagery?
As a clinical psychologist, that's what my training is. It's super important, yes, to figure out what's the real source of it. Because many people can have a similar symptom, but the source of it can be very different between people. That's the fun part for me, to figure out what the source of it is. And then the real creative fun part too is, okay, so if this is the root of it, what can I do to go at that in a really fun, creative way? Sort of like, writing a song. If I want to write a song, I really want to design the notes just right and have the lyrics correspond just right with the notes and putting that all together and then hoping it's a song that resonates with the unconscious so that it'll be open for change and then we'll embrace change.
You're going to hear this recording enough times to where you may start to see the methodology, but it's not your job to figure out why Dr. Marc is putting this imagery in your subconscious. So stop. Just let the words flow through you. It's not your job to focus on them. It's not your job to not focus on them. Just hit play. That's all you're really asking of people, right?
Yeah, as we were talking earlier, sometimes that cerebral cortex, logical part gets in the way. And it tries to control everything. And what it does is interferes with emotional change at times. So when you listen to a sound file at night, the goal is just to let it do its thing. And ideally, you listen to it at bedtime, because the last thing in is the last thing best. The last thing in is the best thing remembered. And So we put in it just before bed. It just kind of germinates all night long and then starts changing dreams like we were talking about earlier. Because let's just say, we dream anywhere, between 4 or 6 times a night. And if our dreams are just basically recycling our fears and worries, well, it's no surprise we wake up irritated or anxious or uncomfortable and just have our fears just be as heightened or even more heightened. So if you can go in there and just sort of seed the dreams and start changing the nature of them, then we not only start changing the unconscious, that's right, we can go backwards, we can change dreams to change the unconscious, but then we also have people wake up differently and then start approaching the outside world differently.
Just a quick question, is there a psychological reason why some people have great dream recall and other people have none?
You're right. Some people are just more naturally good at it. But using myself as an example, I don't think I was particularly good at recalling dreams, but I had a class in grad school where we had to start recalling dreams. And by really focusing on it and using different little tools and techniques, before I knew it, I was recalling 3 to 4 dreams a night.
Wow.
So you can learn it. Yeah.
Now, Dina, you had some questions for Dr. Marc.
Yes. So I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of some of the trends that we've seen in the decades kind of leading up to where we are now and how the current situation might change things for us. So let's see, beginning around the middle of the previous century, we've all been encouraged since childhood to be driven by outward pressure from cultural and family expectations, more recently social media and the internet, giving little or no regard to how this will affect our mental health or happiness. In the past few years, we've been starting to have a conversation about perfectionism and how focusing on accomplishments and other outer appearances of happiness can be correlated with mental health issues. Now that we're living in a world where our circumstances and values are shifting so quickly, we're able to see firsthand how ill-equipped many of us are for handling unprecedented situations that require psychological strength. So has widespread perfectionism thinned out the psychological and social foundations we need to get through a difficult time like the one we're living in?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. We have been programmed in a lot of ways to be externally dependent, to look to the outside as a form of validation or as a reference point. My gosh, we look at these commercials and they tell us what we should wear or what our house should look like or who we should marry or what drugs we should take. And so we have found ourselves more and more because of this internet medium to become controlled by the outside. Now, let me take a step back. Of course, as a primitive species, we had to be very attuned to the outside because our survival depended upon it. So our senses, like our visual, auditory, and so on, were designed in such a way or evolved in such a way that they emphasized the importance of the outside, because if we were attuned to the outside, we had a better chance of survival. So that's how we have evolved. That kept us safe, being externally attentive. So now you take that style and bring it into the current world, which is now trying to magnify that. It brings us to a place, again, that we were never meant to be, just like our fear response. So if we are then so attuned to the outside, what it does is separates us from the resources that we have on the inside, because now we've become less confident. We have less trust in our inner resources. We start to only depend on what the outside delivers. And the more we look to the outside for that, the more we try to control the outside. Because then our self-esteem, our self-worth, everything gets tied up in controlling the outside and making it be a certain way. But the more we try to control the outside, quite honestly, the more we become controlled by the outside, and the more vulnerable we become when the outside changes and we can't.
Right. And right now, the outside is there's so many things that are so far out of our control right in this moment.
Absolutely. And so what that does is make us feel very fearful, very scared, and lack confidence, and not have a trust that we have the inner resources to manage it. And that's a problem. I agree, that's a problem.
And so what are you recommending when friends speak to you who aren't necessarily clients? What are you recommending for people for our best coping possible?
I believe that we've always had to reckon somewhat with being uncomfortable. And I think what has happened before the virus situation is that we've started to become too accustomed to being comfortable, and as a result have become less tolerant of being uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And where historically being a primitive species, where being able to control discomfort helped us survive. Now in the present time, it's almost the antithesis, where now our strength comes from not trying to stop discomfort, but being able to manage discomfort. So it's like a paradigm shift has happened here. So what do we do with this in a practical way? I think this is a wonderful time to take the discomfort that we're feeling and find in the way to tune into inner resources, inner strengths, confidence, to make it so that we can manage it with much less threat. And I say this to you, it may sound kind of magical, but I'm going to give you a great example. Early in my career, I used to have to handle anything that walked off the street. People that were so psychotic, or families that were so angry, throwing things, yelling things, just total chaos. And my job was to walk into that room and somehow fix it. And I used to think, as a young guy walking into this, I have no idea how to fix this. No idea. And what I learned is that once I could scrape away the fear response that was going on, first the anger, you got to scrape away the anger. Then I could scrape away the fear. And then what was beneath all of it was this quiet, peaceful, still feeling. So that surprised me, to think that underneath all the fear is actually a quiet. It's sort of like the ocean. You know, the ocean is just so turbulent, so choppy, but underneath it's so calm and peaceful. So I really believe if we can help people find that quiet place underneath the surface, then we can manage this so much better.
And
Hey, Doc. Oh, sorry.
that message is that it's there. That quiet place is there. No
I believe it's always there. I believe it's always there. Just the trick is being able to find it, and then even more importantly, to have people to be able to trust it.
And access it and trust it.
Just,
yes, Danny.
Just a thought that I've read a little bit about, and curious about your input on it, is that do you think that people in other parts of the world, specifically like, Europe and that area of the world, where they have undergone so much more adversity over the years with wars and borders and invasions and whatnot, as compared to, say, Canada and the US, that have been relatively autonomous and haven't been invaded and have more freedom, that they're more adept at handling things like this outbreak, where it's like, no, I have my freedom. I should be able to go where I want and do it, like where people don't feel that they need to do what's necessary to fight a thing, where over there they go, no, we've been through this, here's what we got to do.
You know what I think with that? It's an interesting question. I think this is where the American frontier spirit really gets in our way. Our country was built on this independence and fierce way of autonomy. And sadly, I think it really hurts us in a time like this to come together. And I think in Europe, they don't have that fierce frontier spirit and guns being ubiquitous and so on. And so I think it creates a different result. I think at one time, I think when there was much more strife and wars and going on, but boy, you saw when this whole immigration thing was happening from the Middle East, how fired up people came in Europe as well. So I think there's just as much fear, but thankfully not as much this overzealous frontier spirit, like don't you dare take away my guns and my independence.
Dr. Marc, how can people receive your help? I noticed on your website you offer a free meditative recording, but how can people best access you online?
Easiest way is my website, which is my name. Marc, I'm not sure if you're putting this up there, but I'll spell it, MarcSchoen.com. And they can see a lot of different things about me and what I do, and like the different things that you mentioned, seminars, particular sound files that might be helpful. But yes, I do have a free breath technique is what I call it. It's a technique I developed years ago, like probably back in the early 80s, when I wasn't allowed to use hypnosis on the medical wards and units at Cedars. So I had to find other ways to chill people because they wouldn't let me do hypnosis. And this one I found lowered blood pressure, lowered pulse. And it's something I use a lot to get people who are pretty ramped up. And so, it's a free, just go on there and you can download it for free.
And talk about your books. You've written 2 books.
Yes, my latest book is very much like what we're talking about this fear response and learning to manage discomfort a lot better. So it describes the process, what's going on physiologically, but then has a lot of different tools and strategies that people can use to help manage discomfort and fear better. And then the previous book was on this letdown effect, what we can do to stop this letdown effect, why we get sick after stress. Bunch of techniques and tools as well.
Okay, so the first book is called Your Survival Instinct is Killing You.
Yes.
And then your previous book is called When a Relaxation is Hazardous to Your Health.
Yeah.
Yes. Right.
So those are the 2 books, and both are available also on Amazon. And you can go to marcschoen.com/products to get the Schoen Breathe technique. So these are available for purchase, correct, Dr. Marc? Some are available for purchase.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. And here's
Could we read what these are?
Go ahead, Dina. You can read them.
Resilience hypnosis, deep sleep hypnosis, healing hypnosis, surgery hypnosis, test performance hypnosis, and the stress answer.
Excellent. And those are available for download and purchase on Dr. Marc's website. Maybe you could create one specifically for this pandemic and make it available. That will help people relax.
Yeah, hypnosis for quarantine.
Yeah.
Yes.
For lockdown.
Yes, that's a great idea.
How to be afraid of something I can't see.
Or the title could be, You'll Have Plenty of Time to Listen to This.
Yeah, no kidding.
I also thought if we were doing a movie about you, that UCLA story, in my head, I pictured him getting up to the free throw line after working with you. And instead of shooting, he did his grade 5 social studies speech.
That is awesome.
That is a great mental image, Danny.
Yeah. It worked.
Wrong intervention. It's supposed to be basketball.
I want to thank Dr. Marc Schoen for joining us today. Our panel is Jamie Alcroft and Danny Mann. Our producer is Dina Friedman. Our tech team is Thomas Hubble, Lane McFadden, Francesco Demanda, and Michael Tellep. Our sound mixer is John Maddox. Our webmaster is Bill Filipiak. I am Louise Palanker. We will see you next week. Be safe, be well, be kind.